All right, guys. So welcome to Fine-Tuning Portraits Part 2. If you were viewing the last webinar, we had a little bit of technical difficulty with the microphone, having a little bit today, but it should go smoothly, at least for the sound and the video goes this time. So basically, we're going to start out where we left off in the last edit, and we're just going to modify this portrait here. Now, there's a few different ways that you can pull out different tonalities in your shots, such as shadow tones and midtones and things like that. With this photo, it's pretty underexposed. If I move my little video here, you can see in the histogram that a lot of the tones in this image are shadow tones. You can see it's really peaking over here to the left side of the histogram, which is where our shadow tones live. We have a little bit of mid-tone boost, and that's in that sky area up there and then this rock, but not too many other tones. It's a really dark photograph. So what we did in the edit, if you were watching in the last webinar, we just took our contrast slider and we just pulled that contrast all the way back to -100. Now, in doing that, you're removing some of the blacks within your photograph, and it's pulling out and opening up the shadow tones within your scene. And it works really nice for underexposed images like this. It just allows you to see some of those details in there that you wouldn't have if you kept all of these sliders the same. So all we're going to do now is we're just going to pull out some of these different tonalities within this image by using these different sliders. So I'm going to zoom in real quick to kind of our facial area, which is where we're going to be focusing. As we're looking at photographs, especially portraits, our eyes tend to just zip right to the face or the eyes. So pretty important thing in portraits, just zoom into the face or close in on the subject and then edit. Just makes it a lot easier to see the details of your subject. So now that we pulled back on our contrast, we have a little bit more room to breathe with these shadow details, but we need a little bit more pop down there. So I'm going to pull up on my shadow tones a little bit more. Just like that. And then I'll pull up on my midtones, and that's going to be those, those middle grays within the shot. Basically the skin tones and all of the tones around these rocks and such. Those are my mid-tones within the image. So I think that looks pretty good, just like that. What I need to do now is I'm going to head down to my white slider, and I need to pull up on my whites a little bit as well. By pulling up on my midtones and my highlights, I'm not actually adding in any true white to the photograph. I'm only pulling up on those specific tonalities with those sliders. So let's just add in a little bit more life to the shot with a tad bit of white. Nothing crazy, just maybe 10. And so if I turn this white slider off, it doesn't do a whole lot, but it just brings a little more oomph to that sky. It makes it look not so flat. And because we pulled back on our contrast slider completely, we don't have any contrast within our image. Well, what we can do to add in a little bit of pop and a little bit of detail is we can do it a few different ways. One way we could do that is we could head down to our black slider, and we could pull back on our black slider, and that will incorporate contrast and detail. So if you want to do it that way, make sure you hold down your J key. That's going to show you your true white and true black. And I'll just pull back on my black slider, and you can see that in blue, it's a big blue overlay. That's all of the true black without any detail in this portrait. And that's just by holding down my J key. It's showing me my clipping warnings. These are just the clippings of these tones. And I just want a hair, just a little bit of true black within the shot. Probably about right there. It looks pretty good. And so now if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard now, we've opened up those shadowy dark tones in our shot, but we've also brought back in some of that contrast that was there at the beginning. And you could also play with your contrast slider and pull it back to bring back some contrast within your shot. But you could always just use the black slider. Really easy to go in and just add a little bit more detail. But the black slider, I would recommend always just adding in a little bit of that blue overlay. As soon as you see about that much, maybe like, I don't know, 8%, 6% of your image, that's probably just enough. You don't want it covered. We don't want this blacks covering all of it, because then it just looks muddied up and really underexposed. So just be careful with the black slider. It can get pretty intense pretty fast. But what do we have it at? Like 8 or 6, I think it was. 6. Perfect. So let's zoom out now, and I'll hit the backslash key on my keyboard one last time, sorry. And yeah, I think that looks pretty good as far as just pulling out the tonalities within this shot. Now the other way you could add in contrast, let's say we remove that black slider. The other way you could add in contrast is you could go into your effects tab here. We could add a filter, and we could apply contrast through a curves filter. So I'll just add a curves filter here. And inside of the curves filter, to add in some contrast to the shot, all I'm going to do is I'm going to head down to this bottom left area, kind of right above this far left point. These are my blacks. This far left point is my black tones. But I want right above it in my shadow tones here. So I'm just going to drop a point, and then I'll just pull it down a little bit. And you can see it's just, you know, darkening those areas within my scene, and it's adding in some contrast. But because we're on a tone curve here, we're pulling back on our midtones and our highlights, so we're kind of just flattening things up. Well, once we pull back, you know, on our contrast to where we want it, we can drop a point in our midtones, and we can drag those back up. And then I can do the same thing, you know, with my highlight tones. So now if we turn off this curves filter, it just adds in a nice little punch to the image, while also, you know, keeping the integrity of all those bright highlights within that sky area. And let's say you're modifying, you know, your tone curve, and you're in here, and you go in here and you start making some cinematic looks, or you're really just going in here and fine tuning your shot. Well, a lot of people with the tone curve, they'll leave it like this, but if you turn this off and on, it really kind of muddies up the browns and especially your skin tones in here. So with the curves filter, I would recommend protecting the tones within your shot from some of the curves effects, if that makes sense. I would recommend, you know, taking a look at your image and identifying what tones in your shot that you don't like with this curves adjustment, and then protect them accordingly. So if I zoom in here to her skin, I don't really like how it's kind of muddying up her skin and making everything really brown. So I can go into my curves filter. I'm going to go to my blending options here. And I'm going to go to these three sliders down here, these highlights, shadows, and skin. And basically that's going to allow me to protect certain tones in my shot from this curves filter. So if I want to alleviate some of that modification from her skin, I can just pull up on these skin tones. And you can see it's protecting those tonalities within the shot. So they're not so intense on that particular tonality. Same thing with my shadows. If I don't want it that intense on my shadows, I can pull that up. And it's just, you know, alleviating the curves filter from that area. Another method you could use to remove some of the color changes that happen when you modify contrast is you could use a blend mode. Now, inside of the curves filter, I really love the blend mode luminosity. And what luminosity does is it basically takes your adjustment and it strictly applies it to the tonalities within your shot, but it avoids all of the color. So if I head down to my blend mode luminosity and I just click on it, you can see it's a little bit subtle, but it removes all of those saturation changes. So if I turn this off and on now, it's strictly applying contrast, but it's not bringing in that warmth that was there earlier. So if I go back to my blending options, oops, oh man, now we're in a different tab. So if I go back to my blending options here for that curves filter, and I go to mode, and I'll just go up to normal, keep an eye on the image. See how it brings back all of that color that was being modified. Now let's say you like that color, but you don't like what it's doing to the brightness of the image. You don't like how much contrast it's adding. Well, we can head into our mode now, and we'll use an opposite blend mode. We'll use the color blend mode. Now it looks a little funky, right? But that's because we have a massive tone curve going down here. But you can see that it doesn't modify any of the exposure or the contrast or the midtones or the shadows. If I turn this off and on, it's only modifying the color. It's literally only adjusting the color tones within our shot. So let's say we like that tone curve right there. We can double click. I'll just name this color curve. Oops. Color curve. And then we'll hide that. We'll add another look or add another filter. We'll add a curves filter. And now we can modify our tonality blend mode, or our tonality curve, by using that luminosity blend mode. So I'll use luminosity. We'll rename this tone curve. So we have color curve and our tone curve. And then we'll head down, and since we have that luminosity blend mode applied, this isn't going to modify any of the colors within our shot. So let's just add in a little bit more contrast like we did before. And then let's boost our midtones a bit. Just like that. So now if we turn off this tone curve, we're only modifying the tones within the image, and we're not adjusting any of the colors, which works out really well for if you really want to just fine tune one or the other. You know, you want to go in there and adjust the colors, and then you want to adjust the tones. So just some options that you can use to really, you know, fine tune the style of your portraits here. So continuing on our fine tuning portraits, we're basically going to keep going with these images that are a little bit underexposed and may have some brighter areas to them. So for example, this image, we have this bright area on her face and then this bright area on his face, but they're a bit underexposed other than that. So what we need to do here is fine tune this portrait so that we can see all of, these tonalities within our subjects here. So first things first, I'm going to head into the Develop tab. I'm going to zoom in. And once I've zoomed in, just kind of pinpointing their faces here, I'm going to head over to my tone and color. And in the last edit, we basically removed all of the contrast, and that allowed us to see some of those darker tones. But for this shot, let's pull up on those specific tones that we want to modify. For example, the shadows. There's a lot of shadowy tones within her face and on him. So let's pull up on our shadow tones here until we can see, just enough shadow detail. You don't want to pull up on all of the shadow tones right away just to 100 and be like, oh, that's a perfect exposure. Because that's not how they would look in real life. I mean, unless you put a flash on them or something. But if you got a sun beaming in over here to the right, it's a little too flat right here. So let's zoom back in. Let's pull back our shadows to about, 52. Because keeping your shadows down is also going to leave the contrast that's there. You don't want to just pull out on all of the shadow tones, because then you're not going to have any contrast within those shadow tones. And then I can pull up on my midtones a little bit. And the midtones are just going to, again, pull out those middle grays within the scene, a lot of these skin tones within the shot. And that looks pretty good, right? Maybe down a bit. And then it's, again, just kind of a fine dance between your contrast and your midtones and your shadow. So let's pull up on our contrast a little bit. Right there. Maybe a little bit more on the midtones. I think that looks pretty good. I think that looks just fine for our base exposure. Let me hold down my J key just to see if we have any true white or true black. So we have a little bit of true white. You can see in red here. It's a little bit blown out, but that's fine. I would honestly rather see a little bit of true white in an image than someone trying to pull back their whites all the way. It looks really flat and unnatural. So having true white in your image is just natural. Don't worry about it unless it's, covering up someone's entire face. But, this much in a shot is not a big deal at all. And you could easily pull back on the exposure slider until it's gone. And now we'll just do the same thing. We'll do what we just did. We'll pull up on our shadows, or our midtones rather, and our shadow tones. And then we'll add in a little bit of contrast. Maybe not that much contrast. Maybe about 55. And you can see in blue over here, all of these areas that are gaining that true black and all of that contrast and detail back into the shot. That actually might be a little bit too much true black, but let's zoom out before we modify. So I'm going to zoom out real quick. And so now if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, actually I think that looks pretty good for the contrast within the image. What we're going to do now is we're actually going to use a local adjustment just to fine tune this area on the bottom left. We don't want to do too much to it. All I want to do is add in some contrast. I know I keep saying contrast, but it's a huge deal in editing and portrait photography. But we're going to add in a little bit of contrast into here and also boost the whites a little bit so that it doesn't look like we just pulled out on the shadows and the midtones. So I'm going to head over to my local adjustments tab. I'm going to add a local adjustment. And in this local adjustment, I don't want anything modifying the exposure. So I'm going to double click that to reset it. I'm going to add in a little bit of contrast like that. Let's just pull it up to 21. And then let's just pull up on our whites a little bit. I think it looks pretty good. So now I'm going to hold down Shift and hit K on my keyboard. That's going to grab me my adjustable gradient. And then I'm just going to drop this down, right there. Doesn't really matter. Then I'll just use this kind of far right handle to rotate it a little bit. And then I'm going to place it near the top of their faces where the sun's beaming in. And it's starting to get lighter in the scene. I'm just going to feather it quite a bit so we don't have a harsh line there. And now it's all about just fine tuning that local adjustment. So I'm just going to turn this off and on real quick. I think that looks pretty good. Maybe a little bit less white. It's a lot of white. That looks better. And then let's add a little bit of structure like that. And then I think we could even warm it up just a hair. Warming things up typically brightens them a bit. It doesn't brighten them a ton, but it does brighten them up just a little bit. And cooling things down darkens things just a hair. So by brightening that exposure or that temperature up a little bit, it just brought in some warmth into the scene and kind of matched the areas around. So now if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, I think that looks pretty good as far as just the, a quick edit for that portrait. Again, we're just fine tuning these shots. We're just going in and pulling out the darker tones so that we can see, everything within our scene. So real quick, it's, kind of a popular thing in portrait photography is retouching and, removing blemishes and such. I kind of feel bad just picking on this photograph to remove blemishes for, but it just makes for an easy example. So for this shot, all I'm going to do first is just set a camera profile for the image. And what that's going to do is it's just going to alleviate some of the darker tones in my shot. If you shoot in RAW, you have the choice of modifying your camera profile over here in tone and color. And if you're shooting RAW portraits, I'd recommend using this ON1 portrait camera profile. It just neutralizes everything and pulls out some of the darker tones in your shot. So if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard now, nothing crazy, but just from doing a camera profile, it does a whole lot. And so now all I want to do is just pull up on my contrast just a little bit. Maybe right there, and then a mid-tone boost. I think that looks pretty good. If we look at our histogram, we have a really well-exposed photo right here. So now let's go down, or zoom in rather. I'm going to zoom in. And if I'm taking a look at this shot, I can see it's a little bit blurry and a little bit out of focus. So one thing that we can do to just sharpen things up is just add in a little bit of detail into her glasses. Now, I don't want any detail anywhere else, but the fact that her glasses, are going to show detail is just going to, make our eyes travel there that much quicker. So to add detail, I'm just going to add an effects filter. I'll add a filter. We'll add dynamic contrast. And I'll just use surreal. I'm going to tone it down anyway. And then I'll hit B on my keyboard, Shift X to switch my paint mode. And I'll increase my opacity to 100. And then we're just painting on detail. Oops. I got to remove this. So I'm going to go into my dynamic contrast mask, and I got to invert this mask so that it's not applied to the shot. And now I can start painting in that detail. Just like that. And we'll make sure that it's not applied outside. So now if I turn this off and on, it just does a good job of making that area pop a bit more so that it looks more in focus. So now let's zoom in and we can start retouching. Now, with this portrait, obviously, there's not a whole lot of blemishes and things going on for their skin. There's just a couple little imperfections right there. So if this is the case, which it's probably going to be the majority of the time, I would just go over to your retouch tools, click on retouch, head up to your retouch brush, which is this Band-Aid looking thing. Make sure that your feather is 100 and your opacity is at 100. That's just going to make sure that it's you know, nice soft brush edge, and it applies 100% of the retouch. And then we're just going to go over, you know, the blemishes we want to remove, and make sure that your brush size is about twice the size of the blemish. It just helps to remove all of whatever you're trying to get rid of. So then I'll just hover over that little blemish right there. I'll brush on, and it removes it right away. So then you can just do that to kind of these major ones. And again, you know, obviously you don't have to do this, but if you want her to, you know, be like, oh, you touched up my skin, thanks so much, probably a good way to do it. Cool. Because she could just be having a bad day, you know, could be having a bad day, gets, you know, one of those bad day acne things going on. It happens to all of us. So this is just a quick way that you can fix any of that. So that looks pretty good, you know, just a little bit better. And again, there wasn't really much going on there, but just to show off how to use the retouching, that's the best way to do it. Stay on the lookout for our next ON1 Live webinar. Have a great rest of your weekend. Thanks again. Have a great day, guys.